The signal had been repeating for 11 years before anyone admitted it was a cry for help. Viktor Serov heard it for the first time in the basement of school No. 47 in Kaluga, coming through a jury-rigged receiver, built from salvaged radio parts and a dream he couldn't quite name. He was 13 years old, sitting cross-legged on a concrete floor with a notebook on his knee and a pencil stub behind his ear. And the sound that came through the static was not music, not noise, not language. It was something between all three, a pattern that repeated every 41 seconds with an ache in it that felt almost biological, like breathing. He sat there for 4 hours without moving, filling 32 pages with waveform diagrams. And when his mother called him for dinner, he didn't answer. He was already somewhere else. He was already in every way that mattered gone. The signal had originated from a star in the Cassiopeia constellation, 27 light-years away. Every major radio telescope on Earth had detected it. The debate that followed lasted the better part of a decade. Natural phenomenon, researchers insisted. A pulsar artifact, a gravitational harmonic, anything but the obvious. The obvious was too large. The obvious meant the universe had turned over in its sleep, and humanity was no longer alone in the dark, and nobody who drew a government salary wanted to be the one standing at the podium when that particular door swung open. Viktor didn't work for the government. Viktor was a boy from Kaluga who had memorized every published paper on relativistic propulsion theory by the time he was 12, and could recite the periodic table backwards while solving differential equations in his head. When the committee at the Academy of Sciences finally held their public forum on the signal, Viktor showed up uninvited with his notebook under his arm and a hand-drawn schematic in his breast pocket, and sat in the third row until the professor chairing the session opened the floor for questions. He didn't ask a question. He walked to the front of the room, unfolded his schematic on the podium, and explained, in approximately 9 minutes, exactly how to build a ship capable of reaching the signal source within a human lifetime. The room went very quiet. The ship he described, he called it the Zarya, which meant dawn in Russian, though the official designation was something longer and less poetic, would run on relativistic annihilation of antimatter, a drive that had been theorized but never attempted, because the engineering margin for error was approximately 0, and the energy output if something went wrong was equivalent to a small nuclear event. It would need a crew experienced enough to adapt to unforeseen conditions, but young enough to survive a 26-year transit and still have working knees when they arrived. It would need people whose brains were still plastic, still growing, still capable of learning a completely unknown language from first principles. Because the sense collectors in the suit design, another of Viktor's innovations, a biometric translation mesh woven into the chest panel of the flight suits, could only initialize in a nervous system that hadn't yet calcified into the pattern-matching ruts of adulthood. The committee asked him who he had in mind for the crew. He said he had a few names. The selection process was, on paper, the most rigorous aptitude evaluation in the history of Soviet science. In practice, it was a group of teenagers showing up at a converted gymnasium in Moscow with increasingly implausible skill sets and an absolute inability to look impressed by anything. Pasha Kozulkov, Viktor's best friend since the 2nd grade, had a memory like a vault. Not photographic exactly, more like a searchable archive, the kind that could cross-reference unrelated data streams under pressure and surface the one connection that mattered. Misha Kopanyagin could hold 6 simultaneous mental models of a mechanical system and rotate them in 3 dimensions while carrying on a normal conversation. Katya Panfarova was a mathematician who had independently derived several published theorems before age 11 and had the additional quality, rarer than any theorem, of staying absolutely calm when everything was on fire. Varya Kuteshikova knew more about xenobiology, the theoretical kind, the kind that had to be built from scratch because there was no actual data yet, than most working academics, and she had the ferocity of someone who'd spent her entire childhood being told her interests were imaginary. Then there was Fedya Lobanov. Fedya was not selected. Fedya was not even supposed to be there. He showed up on launch day with a bag of personal items and a story about having a cousin in the technical division, which was not true and which he admitted immediately when pressed. And the honest answer when they asked him why he'd come was that he didn't know, exactly, except that the thought of staying behind had felt worse than anything he could imagine. He was big and loud and thought with his hands before his head, and he drove Viktor to the edge of patience on a near-daily basis. But there was something in him, a stubbornness, a physical certainty, A refusal to accept that a situation was terminal, that Victor noted and filed away without quite knowing what to do with it. They put Fedya in a storage compartment to deal with later. Someone forgot to deal with him before launch. The Zarya broke atmosphere on a Thursday morning in October. Victor watched Earth shrink in the aft cameras for exactly as long as he could stand it, which was about 40 seconds. And then he turned back to his instruments and began running pre-flight checks on the antimatter containment systems. The rest of the crew did the same, each of them going through their respective rituals, Pasha talking softly to himself as he memorized the emergency protocols, Katya running probability trees in her head that showed on her face as a very faint furrow between her brows, Misha standing absolutely still in front of the navigation array in a way that suggested he was already somewhere ahead of them. Varya sat at the xenobiology station and began updating her theoretical models for what they might find. Working from the signal's acoustic structure and the 17 ways the 41-second repeat cycle could encode biological data. Nobody talked much, space did that. Even at 13 they felt it. The specific weight of the distance behind them and the specific weight of what was ahead, and the strange suspension of floating between the two. Fedya was discovered in the engine compartment approximately 4 hours after launch, wedged behind a coolant manifold with his bag of personal items and an expression of aggressive innocence. Victor stared at him for a long time without speaking. "I have relevant skills," Fedya said. "Like what? I'm good with my hands. We have robots for that. I'm better than the robots." This was, as it turned out, not a boast. Fedya had an almost supernatural spatial intuition around mechanical systems, could feel a misaligned component the way some people feel a change in weather, and his hands, large, calloused, precise, could work in spaces the robots couldn't navigate. He also had no quit in him, none at all. Victor had never met anyone with less quit in them, and in the years that followed, he would come to understand that this was not stubbornness for its own sake but something deeper, something that didn't have a clean name in any language, a refusal to believe that a problem was allowed to win. They were arguing about whether to jettison him when Fedya, who had been leaning against a console he had not been told not to touch, accidentally activated the emergency thrust override. What followed happened very fast. The Zarya's antimatter drive surged beyond its rated output by a factor of 11. The relativistic effect compounded. The ship's external sensors showed the star field stretching, then smearing, then resolving into something that had no precedent in any published physics. The speed of light, which Victor had calculated as a hard ceiling, turned out to be more of a strong suggestion under the specific conditions of antimatter annihilation at 11 times rated output. The ship's computer ran its confusion diagnostic 17 times and gotten 17 different answers, all of them wrong. Victor looked at his instruments for a long time. "We're alive," Pasha said, which was technically a question. "We're alive," Victor confirmed. "That shouldn't be possible." "No, are we still going to Cassiopeia?" Victor looked at the navigation array. The signal, the 41-second signal, the one that had kept him on a concrete floor for 4 hours with a notebook and a dream, was louder now. Closer. His instruments suggested it was approximately 27 years closer, which aligned very badly with the 14 hours since launch. "We're going to Cassiopeia," Victor said. "We're just going to get there sooner than planned." The transmission from Earth came through 6 days later, after the communication delay had been factored in and the signal boosted through the Zarya's deep-range array. The face that appeared on the screen was academician Filatov, who had been 41 years old at launch and was now, visibly, older than Victor's grandfather. Behind him, through the window of the transmission center, the world looked the same, and different in ways Victor couldn't quite catalog. The same sky, slightly different shapes on the horizon. The same kind of human faces in the background, but with different haircuts and different expressions. The expressions of people who'd had time to learn how to feel about things. 27 years. On Earth, 27 years had passed. Their classmates had grown up, finished school, married, built careers, had children. The world had continued at its normal speed, while they had slipped sideways through time like a stone skipped across water. And then Milka Okorokova appeared on the screen behind Filatov, gray-haired now, with a professional badge on her lapel, and 2 children visible in a framed photograph on her desk. And Victor felt something move in his chest that he didn't have vocabulary for at 13, but recognized later, in retrospect, as the specific ache of a door closing on a world that had kept turning without you. She was a radio astronomer now. She had spent 27 years studying the signal. She had dedicated her professional life to the message they were going to find. She looked at the camera, at Victor, specifically, who hadn't aged a day, with an expression that was mostly professional and only slight something else, and she said the signals from Alpha Cassiopeia had not stopped. They had, in the last 3 years, changed. They were no longer 41 seconds apart. They were 39, then 37, then 35. The interval was shrinking, the pattern was accelerating, and the acoustic structure of the signal had shifted from a repeating tone to something that had what she could only describe as urgency in it. "It's not a greeting," she said. "We think it's a distress call." Fedya, who had been standing in the doorway of the communications room, listening without permission, said nothing for once. He looked at Victor. Victor looked at the navigation array, where the signal was burning like a steady light in the forward sensors. "How long until we arrive?" Katya asked. 6 weeks, Victor said. 6 weeks. They spent the time preparing, which meant different things for each of them. Katya and Varya worked around the clock on the sense collector calibration, refining the biometric translation protocols to account for every xenobiological model Varya had ever built. Carbon-based, silicon-based, plasma-based, distributed consciousness, hive cognition, forms that didn't map to Earth taxonomy at all. The sense collectors on their flight suits were extraordinary things, grown more than built, their mesh sensitive to a frequency range 30 times wider than human hearing, and capable of processing symbolic information in 14 different structural formats. They had never been tested on actual alien communication. They had been tested on theoretical alien communication, which was like practicing surgery on a diagram. Misha sat with the navigation data every morning for 3 hours, running silent calculations that would surface as occasionally as a muttered observation. "The signal source is moving," he said once, and then didn't say anything else, for another hour. And when he did speak again, it was to add, quietly, "Not toward us," which Victor filed away with the other data points and the growing shape they were making together. Pasha built a contact protocol from first principles, working backward from everything humanity knew about mathematical universals. Prime sequences, geometric ratios, physical constants, and building a transmission that could be recognized as intentional by any mind capable of intentional recognition, regardless of its substrate. Victor ran checks on the antimatter drive. He did this not because it needed checking, but because the doing of it helped him think. And what he was thinking about was the gap between a distress signal and a rescue operation, and what it meant to arrive 27 years late to an emergency that was still, apparently, ongoing. Fedya fixed things. The ship had a list of maintenance tasks that would have taken the maintenance robots 3 months. Fedya got through them in 11 days, working 18-hour stretches with nothing but black tea and the specific meditative focus he applied to any physical problem. He didn't talk much during this period, which was new, and Victor noticed it without comment. There was something working itself out in Fedya that needed quiet, and Victor had learned by now that Fedya's silences were sometimes the most significant thing he did. On the 41st day, the sensors resolved the Alpha Cassiopeia system from a smear of light into a structure, and then into a world, and then as they decelerated into high orbit, into something none of them had specifically expected. There were 2 planets in the habitable zone. The inner one was dead, geologically active, atmospherically toxic, clearly never having hosted complex life. The outer one was the source of the signal, and it was, by every metric the Zarya's sensors could measure, extraordinary. A world somewhat larger than Earth, with a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere and liquid water, and an electromagnetic signature consistent with a technological civilization at approximately Earth's mid-century level of development. And it was silent. Not radio silent. The 41-second signal was still there, still broadcasting, now 29 seconds and falling. But the rest of the spectrum that a civilization at that development level should have been filling with noise. Communications, navigation beacons, independent missions, the electromagnetic exhaust of a species that had learned to harness electricity was absent. Something happened to them, Varya said, and said it the way she said everything, without drama, as a statement of fact that needed to be followed by analysis. They found the answer in orbit. Specifically, they found it surrounding the planet like a shell, a debris field of extraordinary density, the shattered remnants of orbital infrastructure on a scale that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. Stations, platforms, relay networks, the skeletal frames of structures so large they had no human equivalent. All of it destroyed, all of it cold. And among the debris, moving with deliberate purpose, were ships. not the ships of the civilization below. Those, the Zarya's historical reconstruction protocols determined, would have looked like the debris, smooth, organic in their geometry, built in a style that suggested a species that thought in curves. These were different, angular, dense. The hull material registered as an alloy unknown to the Zarya's materials database, and the drive signature was. Victor stared at his readouts for a long time. The drive signature was consuming matter, not burning fuel, consuming the debris field. The wrecks of the dead civilization were fuel for the ships that had destroyed it. There are 7 of them, Misha said very quietly. 8, said Pasha. One of them is behind the second moon. It's running quiet. Why are they still here? Katya asked. Varya answered without looking up from her station. Because whatever was down there, they didn't finish. The signal is still broadcasting. Something survived. The debate that followed was the most important conversation Victor had ever been part of, and it lasted 4 hours. And at the end of it they had agreed on exactly nothing except that they were not leaving. This was the extent of their consensus. They were not leaving. Everything else was still in motion. Fedya, who had not spoken during the debate, raised his hand. Victor looked at him. I have a thought, Fedya said. Does it involve the emergency thrust override? This time it's on purpose. The plan that came out of the next 6 hours of argument and calculation, and Fedya demonstrating things with his hands that were genuinely difficult to follow but made sense once you saw them, was not elegant. Victor wanted it on record that it was not elegant. Katya's probability trees gave it somewhere between a 19 and a 43% chance of working, which was a range wide enough to suggest the model was based on insufficient data, which it was. Pasha's contact protocol had never been tested. The sense collectors had never processed actual alien communication. And the angular ships in the debris field were capable of accelerating to 0.3 c within 12 seconds, which meant the Zarya's tactical window was very small. What they had on their side, they had arrived at 0.7 c and decelerated fast, which the debris field sensors had almost certainly tracked. They were unknown. They were unexpected. In the angular ship's operational calculus, they did not exist as a category, which meant there was a moment, brief, closing, in which the alien fleet did not know what to do with them. They had a sense collector array that could, in theory, interface with any signal-producing technology in the electromagnetic spectrum. They had Fedya, who could feel a mechanical system the way some people feel weather, and they had the signal, the distress call, the thing that had been repeating for 38 years from the surface of this world, patient and persistent, and refusing, against all evidence, to stop. Pasha's broadcast went out on all frequencies simultaneously, the mathematical universal, prime sequences, physical constants, the geometric ratio that meant the same thing in every mind that had ever counted stars, wrapped around a single pulse that said in the only language the universe guaranteed, we are here, we are new, we know you are here. The angular ships reacted within 90 seconds. 6 of them turned toward the Zarya. The 8th, the quiet one behind the second moon, went very still in a way that registered on the sensors as something between attention and recalculation. They're targeting us, Misha said. I know, Victor said. Victor, I know. He had his hands on the thrust controls. Fedya, tell me when. Fedya was not at a console. He was in the engine compartment, where he had spent the last 4 hours taking apart and reassembling a specific section of the antimatter drive in a configuration that was not in any manual because it was not supposed to be done, and had never been attempted and violated several of the design assumptions Victor had built the ship around. But Fedya had felt something in the system during those 11 days of maintenance. A resonance, a potential. The way a locked door sometimes rattles in a specific way that tells you exactly where the bolt is if your hands are sensitive enough. Not yet, Fedya said over the intercom. The 6 angular ships accelerated. Weapon signatures appeared on the sensor array. Energy weapons, high power, the discharge profile suggesting a technology that liquefied hull material rather than puncturing it. Fedya, not yet. Katya was running probability trees in real time, updating every 2 seconds, her voice absolutely flat. Window closing. 30 seconds to weapons range, Fedya, now. Victor activated the drive configuration Fedya had built. What happened was not technically what he'd planned, because Fedya's instinct had found something in the antimatter annihilation process that the theory hadn't predicted, not the superluminal effect of launch day, something different, something more controlled, a brief and violent spike in the electromagnetic output of the drive that expanded outward in a sphere at the speed of light and hit every powered system within 3,000 kilometers, with a wave of electromagnetic disruption so precisely tuned by Fedya's hands and Fedya's instinct that it targeted conducting alloys specifically. The angular ship's weapon systems went dark, not destroyed, disabled. There was a difference, and Victor was aware that this difference was the hinge everything else would turn on. Pasha's broadcast was still going, mathematical universals. We are here, we are new, we know you are here. Into the disruption, into the silence, into the moment that opened like a held breath between one catastrophe and the next. The eighth ship, the quiet one, moved from behind the second moon. It was much smaller than the others. Its hull material was different, the same unknown alloy, but older, or differently manufactured, or assembled by different hands under different conditions. It moved without the aggressive geometry of the larger ships, without the angular certainty of a weapon platform, with something that in any earthly context, Victor would have described as caution. The sense collectors on his suit lit up. The sound that came through them was not the 41-second signal from the surface. It was something faster, more complex, structured differently, but it had the same ache in it, the same quality Victor had recognized on a concrete floor in Kaluga at the age of 13, the quality he'd never had a clean word for, something between need and reaching, and the specific frequency of a voice that has been calling for a long time into a silence it was afraid would never answer. Varya was at her station. Her hands were moving faster than Victor had ever seen them move. "The mesh is initializing," she said. "It's working." "Victor, the sense collectors are working." The sound resolved. Not into words, not yet. The calibration would take hours. But into meaning, the way certain music conveys meaning before you understand the words, before you know the language, before you know anything about the culture, or the context, or the specific grief the song was written in. The meaning was not complicated. They were not the destroyers. They were what remained. They had been sending the signal for 38 years, not because they expected rescue. They had stopped expecting rescue around year 10, but because they could not stop. Because they were built for communication the way humans are built to breathe. Because a species that has lost everything except the capacity to reach outward will keep reaching as long as there is anything left that can form a signal. They were not, Victor understood, sending a distress call. They were sending proof. Proof that they had existed. Proof against the silence that the destroyers wanted. He sat with that for a moment. Around him the ship ran its systems. Misha tracked the disabled angular fleet. Katia updated her models. Fedya came up from the engine compartment covered in something that smelled like ozone and machine oil, and sat down on the floor of the corridor outside the communications room, with his back against the wall and his hands open on his knees, looking at nothing. Victor stood up from his station and sat down next to him. They were quiet for a while. "That thing you did with the drive," Victor said. "Yeah, is it repeatable?" Fedya was quiet for a moment, probably not exactly, but something like it. "The principle is." He moved his hands, the old gesture, the thinking with his hands thing that Victor had found infuriating in the beginning and had come to read as fluently as language. "The principle is that the annihilation process has harmonics. You can tune them if you know what you're listening for. You know what you're listening for. I know now. I didn't when I started." Victor nodded. "That's how most things work." The angular fleet was going to recover. The electromagnetic disruption would fade, and they would have weapons again. And they were 7 ships against 1, and the tactical calculus was not improving. Victor was aware of this the way you're aware of weather, as a condition that required response, not panic. What they had now that they hadn't had 3 hours ago, they had a channel. The sense collectors were still initializing, Varya and Katia working through the calibration, while Pasha cross-referenced every structural element against his universal contact protocols. But the channel was open, and the 8th ship, the small cautious one, had not closed it. They had proof of concept. The electromagnetic disruption had shown the angular fleet that the Zarya was not a threat they could simply process and remove. They were a category problem. Unknown origins, unknown capabilities, unpredictable physics. They had, Victor was beginning to understand, something the angular fleet had probably not encountered in a long time. Something it couldn't predict. The second broadcast went out differently than the first. Not mathematical universals. Something more specific, a response to what the sense collectors had captured, fed back through the array in the same acoustic structure as the signal, carrying the same quality, shaped by the same 41-second rhythm that Victor had memorized at 13 years old, on a concrete floor in Kaluga, with a pencil stub behind his ear. "We heard you. We came. We know what you built, and we know what was done to it, and we are standing in front of it." Pashas watched the signal processing board. His voice when he spoke was very careful. "They're responding. The 8th ship. Victor, there's data in the response, compressed, layered. Varya, I'm routing it to your station." Varya was already pulling it apart. "It's not linguistic," she said. "It's historical, record-keeping. They're sending us history." The history took 3 hours to receive in full, and another 6 to process through the sense collectors. And by the time they had a working model of what it contained, the Angular fleet had recovered partial weapons capability and was holding position, which Misha noted with the specific neutrality he used when he was deciding something was significant, but didn't know what to do with it yet. The history was this: the destroyers had come from outside the system. They had come with speed and force, and a logic that the inhabitants of Alpha Cassiopeia had spent 30 years trying to understand and had failed to. Not because they weren't intelligent enough, but because the logic was not communicable. It was not a philosophy or an ideology that could be argued with. It was a process, like digestion, like weather, and the civilization that had built the orbital infrastructure now swimming in cold debris had been, to the destroyers, simply fuel, mass, resource. They consumed civilizations the way fire consumes wood, not with malice, without malice, which was in some ways worse. They had not expected the humans. That was the core of it, the pivot the history kept returning to. The destroyers had a complete model of this star system, refined over 30 years of occupation, and the model had not included a second technological civilization, arriving at 0.7 C from the direction of a small yellow star 27 light-years away. The electromagnetic disruption had been processed as an anomaly. Anomalies, in the destroyer's operational logic, were dangerous. They were not retreating. Victor was clear-eyed about that. They were calculating. "So we have time," Fedya said. He was back at his station now, the ozone smell still on his suit, his hands moving over the engine control interface the way they always moved. With certainty, with the easy authority of someone who knows exactly what he's touching. "We have some time," Victor said. "What do we do with it? What we came to do." What they came to do took another 4 days, and it was not a battle. Victor wanted that on record too. It was not a battle. It was something harder and stranger and less satisfying as a story than a battle would have been. It was communication. It was Pasha and Varya and Katya and the sense collectors running on the edge of their calibration range, pulling meaning from a species that had been sending meaning into the dark for 38 years. And the meaning was not just history. It was the technical architecture of the signal itself, the encoding protocols, the mathematical framework of a communication system built by minds that thought differently than human minds. And Victor and Misha were taking that framework apart and finding in it, slowly, painfully, over hours of cross-referencing with Pasha's contact protocols, something that could be used. The destroyers processed things. That was their logic. They consumed and they processed, and they converted mass into utility. And they had done it to every civilization they had encountered since. The sense collectors were drawing this from the compressed history, Varya surfacing it in fragments. Since before anyone in this corner of the galaxy had developed radio, they did not communicate. They had never needed to. What was there to say to fuel? But the Zarya was not fuel they could reach, and it was broadcasting something that their systems were registering as an anomaly. And anomalies disrupted processing. The destroyers' weapons were back online. They had not used them. They were, in some deep mechanical sense, stuck, and the sticking was the opening. "They can receive," Misha said on the 3rd night. He'd been sitting with the destroyer ship's signal profiles for 48 hours, running a model that was almost too large for his head. "They don't communicate, but they receive. They have to navigate, to calculate mass, to coordinate the fleet. They process incoming data." Victor looked at him. "So we give them data, specific data," Misha said. "The kind their processing architecture is designed to evaluate." "What kind is that?" Misha was quiet for a moment. "Cost," he said, "resource cost. The calculus of whether a target is worth the consumption." Pasha understood it first. His mouth moved slightly without sound. The thing he did when pieces were connecting. "We make ourselves not worth it. Not just us," Victor said. He was looking at the navigation array, at the 27 light-years behind them, at the small yellow star that had taken 11 years to admit it wasn't alone. All of us. What Pasha built in the next 18 hours was the most extraordinary thing Victor had ever watched a human mind produce. It was not a weapon or a shield. It was a transmission, technically. A flood of transmissions riding every frequency the Zarya's array could generate simultaneously. All of them structured in the destroyer ship's own data format, which the sense collectors had reverse-engineered from the navigation and coordination signals the fleet had been exchanging throughout. The content was mathematical. It was the specific mathematics of cost, the energy expenditure required to pursue one target across 27 light-years, versus the diminishing returns of a system already consumed, the resource calculation of a species that was not a fixed location but a civilization in motion, present at this star and present at its origin star, and now demonstrably capable of being present at both simultaneously, which was not something the destroyer processing architecture had encountered before, and which, Mishi's model suggested, would not compute cleanly within their operational logic. They were telling the destroyers, "We are expensive. We are so expensive it doesn't balance." It wasn't certain. Katya's probability model, updated with everything they'd learned, put the range between 31 and 67%, which was better than 19 to 43, but still a range you wouldn't bet a civilization on under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. These were the only circumstances available. Victor sat at his station and watched the destroyer fleet process the transmission. On the sensors, the angular ships moved in small, precise adjustments, the computational equivalent, he thought, of a mind reorganizing itself around a new piece of information. The eighth ship, the small, cautious one, had moved closer over the last 2 days, maintaining a distance that the sense collectors interpreted as attention. Fedya came and stood beside Victor's station. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on the back of Victor's chair. Not on Victor's shoulder, just on the chair, the gesture of someone who wanted to be close to something without making a claim on it. Victor looked at his instruments. The destroyers recalculated for 11 hours. Then the 6 angular ships changed course. Not toward the Zarya. Away from it, and away from Alpha Cassiopeia, the specific vector of a fleet that has completed a calculation and determined, in the cold arithmetic of consumption and cost, that there is more efficient fuel elsewhere. They were not defeated. Victor kept this clear in his mind. They had not been beaten in any permanent sense. They had been made temporarily not worth it, which was a different thing and a smaller victory than it looked like from the outside. But smaller victories, compounded, were how most things that mattered got done. He'd this learned from his instruments and his notebooks in the 41-second signal, and the girl who'd sent him a note he'd spent years trying to decode, the girl who was now a radio astronomer with gray hair and 2 children and 27 years of dedicated work behind her, and what she'd built with those 27 years, had been waiting here for them when they arrived, already encoded in the signal, the precise analytical framework that Pasha needed, and Varya had recognized, and Misha had applied, and Fedya had. Fedya had done what Fedya did, which was reach into the physical world with his extraordinary hands and find the resonance that the theory had missed. The 8th ship held its position as the angular fleet departed. On the sense collectors, a final transmission came through. Not compressed history this time, not technical architecture, something shorter and simpler and more direct. The calibration had improved enough over 4 days that Varya could render it in approximate terms, which she did quietly, while the rest of them watched the angular ships shrink on the sensors. It was not, she said, a thank you. The beings who had been sending the signal for 38 years did not have a cultural frame for gratitude that mapped to anything human, and she wasn't going to pretend they did for the sake of emotional tidiness. It was something more like recognition. It was the specific frequency of a voice that had been calling into the dark and had been answered, and the answering had not been what it expected. Had been something cheesier and smaller and more improbable, and the recognition was for the improbability itself, for the fact that the universe had produced, somewhere near a small yellow star, something that had heard the signal and built a ship and crossed the dark in the specific way that only a very young species, with very young minds and very urgent questions, and a complete inability to accept that a problem was allowed to win, could possibly have crossed it. Victor stood up from his station. He was stiff. He'd been sitting for the better part of 30 hours, and the ship's artificial gravity was slightly off in a way he'd grown so used to that he only noticed it when he stood up suddenly. He walked to the observation port and looked at the star. It was not home. The star that was home was behind him. 27 light-years and 27 years of other people's living away. And Milka Okorkova had gray hair now. And there were people walking around on Earth who had been born after they'd left, and who would have grandchildren before the Zarya returned. But the signal was still broadcasting. He stood at the port and listened to it through the sense collectors. 41 seconds, 39, 37, the interval still falling. And he understood now what the falling interval meant. Not urgency, not desperation, but resolution. The closing of a count that had been running for 38 years, the way a sentence closes when it's finally been heard. He thought about the girl in the basement, the one who'd sent the note. He thought about Kaluga. He thought about the sound on a jury-rigged receiver that had felt like breathing, like something alive, on the other end of the frequency, something that needed and reached and refused to stop. He turned back to his crew. Pasha was asleep at his station, his head on his arms, his body finally releasing the 48-hour vigil. Misha was running calculations that were probably already weeks ahead of current circumstances, provisioning for problems they hadn't encountered yet. Katya was updating her probability models with the actual data, feeding the reality of what had happened back into the theory to see where the theory had been right and where it had been wrong, which was how science worked when it was working. Varya was still at the xenobiology station, pulling everything she could from the compressed history, 38 years of preserved culture, compressed into a signal that had been burning toward Earth for longer than some of them had been alive. A civilization's entire remaining archive entrusted to the magnetic spectrum on the chance that someone somewhere was listening. Someone had been listening. A boy from Kaluga with a notebook and a pencil stub and a dream he couldn't name. Fedya was in the engine compartment. Victor could hear him. The specific sounds of someone who understood machines in his hands. The small, precise noises of maintenance done not because it was required, but because the doing of it was itself a form of thinking. A way of staying close to the thing you depended on, the thing that had gotten you here. Victor went back to his station. He had calculations to run, the return trajectory, the communication protocols to establish with the 8th ship, the archive transfer that would need to begin soon before the preservation media degraded further. The 100 practical things that followed from victory and needed doing regardless of how you felt about it. He ran them. Outside the Zarya, the debris field turned slowly in the light of a distant star, the cold remnants of something that had been extraordinary, and the signal counted down its intervals. And the universe was quiet in the specific way it gets quiet after something large has shifted. Not empty but attentive. The silence of a space that is waiting to see what happens next. 27 light-years away, a radio telescope pointed at Cassiopeia. In its control room, a gray-haired astronomer was on shift, had been on shift every night for 27 years, recording and analyzing and waiting with the particular patience of someone who has decided that the waiting itself is the work. The signal changed, not in interval, not in frequency, in content. The 41-second structure remained, but woven into it now was something new, something that hadn't been there before, a secondary encoding that was not the compressed history of the beings below, not the destroyer's data format, but something recognizable. Something built from prime sequences and physical constants and geometric ratios. Something that said in the only language the universe guaranteed to everyone who had ever counted stars. We are here. We found them. We are all still here. She sat back in her chair. On her desk, the framed photograph of her 2 children looked back at her. Through the window of the control room, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the specific gray that comes before dawn, before the yellow star rises, and the world fills up with ordinary light and ordinary time. She picked up her pen and began writing.